Well, today's chapter is the final chapter. It's working with karma. And so he feels that karmic theory, especially as presented in his book, but it's not a unique presentation. The Karmapa has said very similar things, that it shows us how to work on improving ourselves. And actually, that's what the whole Buddhist path is about us shedding our faults and growing our positive qualities. And it starts by being more positive. And so to quote him on page 135, we just try not to do our worst. And that's where you start. And so that is a very high bar to, you might say, jump over. Don't expect immediate results. Don't try to transform yourself overnight. So be realistic about what is possible, what you want to accomplish. And this is a really important point, and that is, don't try to improve by constantly beating yourself up. That is a self-improvement regimen that is guaranteed not to work. It'll just make you feel bad. In fact, it'll keep you right where you are. So we have to let go of things that we can't quickly attain. And that letting go actually produces positive karma. Because you're no longer thinking about impossible things that generate negative thoughts and negative karma. And in fact, one of the slogans in the 7 Points of Mind training is, don't try to be the fastest. So let go of trying to be the fastest. He says that bad habits are confining. And some of you have heard me talk about, we live in a self-created jail. Trungpa Rinpoche talked about the cocoon, and Pema Chodron's going to talk briefly about that too. But either way, the idea is that our bad habits give us no freedom. They're very confining and constricting. And we just keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. And even though it's not working, our approach seems to be, then we just haven't done enough of it. So we don't see possibilities when it comes to bad habits. Good actions that are done without ego are central to avoiding creating karma. This is where spontaneity comes in, spontaneous actions, and they are not habit forming. And on page 136, he says this about spontaneous actions. Suddenly, we become more ingenious about ways we can go about things. We see lots of possibilities. Now, which reminds me of a quote by Suzuki Roshi, which is that an expert's mind has few possibilities, a beginner's mind has many possibilities. And the idea is that a beginner is free of habitual patterns and sees all kinds of different possibilities that you can go in a situation, and every situation is new and fresh. So being in a positive mood and a positive way of being, we pick up on what needs to be done. It becomes almost obvious where you're going to go without having to think about it a lot. So he also says this, that good karma is not habit forming. as long as it doesn't arise from ego obsession. Some people, what he means by that is some people feel that they're a better person if they engage in positive deeds and so forth. But that's ego obsession. The idea of engaging in positive deeds is just to do it because it's beneficial for everybody, rather than because it makes you look better in the eyes of others, or it makes you feel better about yourself. So, and I'm laughing at the next quote, but I can relate to it. And it's on 137. He said, due to our habits, we have done almost every conceivable thing except take full advantage of our potentiality. And the Buddha is ample evidence of what our full potential is. And we have gone lifetime after lifetime after lifetime in the opposite direction of just accumulating more bad habits and more negative karma. So he then says, here's an interesting sign that we can use, and that is mental suffering is a warning sign that we need to do something about this suffering and we need to have a new approach. I've talked about this in reference to depression, that depression is a sign of our inner goodness saying, this is not working, we have to try something different. So he says just mental suffering in general can act this way. You could say in a way that mental suffering when we're going through this is a time to reboot and have a fresh start here. So he says when the body is in physical pain, we go see medical help. And so he says now is a time to realize that we need to have spiritual help. That he says we have a, quote, urge to become awakened. This is our inner goodness, our noble heart, to use a Karmapa's word. And it's really telling us that we need to move on and get to a better place. That's what suffering is telling us. So our real wealth is inner. It's the source of positive thoughts, positive emotions, positive feelings, and then, of course, wholesome activities of body and speech as well. And all of this leads to satisfaction. So this is really important to go in the direction of having more positive actions of body, speech, and mind, and encouraging these things. The Karmapa has said that it is good to lean, you might say, a little more to the positive than circumstances would warrant. There's nothing wrong with that. So satisfaction leads to us feeling enriched in our lives. And the more we feel enriched, this inner wealth, the less we are attached to outer things. They lose some of their importance to us. We realize that, well, they really don't have the source of happiness. They can make us more comfortable and so on and so forth. But in terms of happiness, if we don't have this or that in our lives, it's not a big problem. And we're still happy. So and he says that that this kind of, I think he uses the term a ripple effect, that these feelings interact, are interdependent with other thoughts and feelings, memories, and then have physical influences on our body. And so he says that this can be extremely beneficial throughout our body and mind. He says, quote, there are many kinds of networks operating simultaneously in our psychophysical system at any given time. This is on page 139. So then to go on, he talks about the difference between moral failure, which is not knowing any better, and moral wrongness, which is knowing better and still doing it. And he then says that mostly we suffer from moral failure due to ignorance. But you suffer from moral wrongness if you are fully aware of what you're doing and you still do it. So it's good to pay attention, especially paying attention to what's going on inside of us. That, of course, negative thoughts, negative emotions, and feelings and moods will pop up in our mind. But if we maintain our awareness, we don't latch on to them. We don't let them dwell. We can let them come and go. Because of impermanence, they always will go if we let go of them. Reacting with fear can actually be a problem and make them stronger. But just being aware of them and then letting go of them, or moving your mind to something more positive. Absolutely nothing wrong if you start getting overwhelmed by negative thoughts to do Om Mani Padme Hum for a while. And just be mindful of the mantra, the sound, and so forth. So he says that he talks about strengthening our character. And I like that term, strengthening our character. That this is what cultivating ourselves karmically does. It's building ourselves up into a person of character. I believe it was Tai Situ Rinpoche that said sincerity and honesty and leads to developing wisdom. So cultivating ourselves karmically leads to being sincere and being honest, knowing ourselves very well, and leading towards these positive thoughts, motivations, emotions and moods and so forth. And this builds us up into a person that we're really going towards becoming a bodhisattva. And he says we need to be strong and resolute. And that, again, is a caring strength, a kind strength, a loving strength. And the same thing with resolute. Is being strong is not like being a drill sergeant. It is a gentle, nourishing strength. But we realize that we have to break these habits, and we have to exert ourselves, be strong, and be diligent. So he says that the problem with samsara is that we're using up our positive karma and constantly creating negative karma by chasing after pleasure. That by just trying to avoid suffering for ourselves and then just chasing after pleasure. And it's due to ego clinging and putting ourselves in front of other people as being more important than other people. So in doing this, we are spending our good karma, and it does take good karma to be born in the human realm. And we have a much better karma than most humans because we are living in the United States and Canada with a very high standard of living. And of all the people that live in the United States, we may not be the 1%, but we still have a much better standard of living and are more secure than most people are in this country, I feel. So we're actually in a very good place. We've here because of good karma. And we need to start accumulating more good karma so that in our next life, you might say we don't go to a worse place. He even uses the idea of going into debt to have pleasure, which makes a lot of sense. It's a good analogy. So on 41, he has this quote, which again, I really appreciate and relate to. When we enrich ourselves, and then I put in parentheses, karmically, our sense of selfhood blossoms, which is different than egohood. It is, we start realizing that we have so much inner strength, so many inner qualities that we have to offer to the world. We stop seeing ourselves as a lump of coal that we're trying to purify and turn that lump of coal into white. We start realizing and becoming our potential. And he says that appreciation, gratitude, satisfaction, and fulfillment are the result of all of this. And then, quote, this is the aim of life. So, just about done here with this chapter, but then there is the conclusion. So it looks like I'll have no trouble finishing up here. That we start appreciating ourselves, appreciating who we are, caring for ourselves, nurturing. We develop a soft spot for ourselves. We start loving ourselves instead of being loathing ourselves, or sometimes loathing ourselves or what we have done, and so forth. Then he makes the analogy between accumulating karma in terms of negative karma and accumulating junk in a house that you have lived in for a long time. And I could relate to this because we just attach to belongings that we have. They might have little value to anybody else, but to us, we think that they're really important. And so here is my personal story, is that I moved out here in 1971. And well, I didn't have a lot of money at the time. In fact, I had little money at the time, but I still managed to bring out things from Minneapolis, where I used to live with my wife and my son. And we had bought at estate sales, thrift sales, quote unquote antique stores, um, and brought out those. It took a number of trips with a trailer to bring it all out. And then after here, I would go to auctions and buy stuff up. And when we split up, it was 1987, and we had an auction. Oh, and I had been doing hobby farming at the time, and I had brought home a huge amount of other things, implements, tractors, and everything else that was really valuable stuff. And so we had an auction, and it went on all day long. We sold a lot of things. She kept enough to furnish an apartment where she moved to about 20 miles away from here. And I had enough furniture in the house. I had a bed, a dresser, I had some chairs, a couch, and other sorts of things, kitchen table, no problem. I wasn't sitting on the floor or using boxes or anything, but we still sold, had an auction and sold things all day long. That gives you an idea how much stuff I had. But on top of that, for some reason or other, the people that came to the auction didn't think it was nearly as valuable as I did. And it was a real, what would I say, learning experience, seeing stuff that I thought was worth, let's say, $1, go for a dime. And needless to say, I don't miss any of it. I have more than once gone visiting people and seen a number of my old pieces of furniture there. And needless to say, I never offered to buy it back. So it's really good to view our old karma like that we need to get rid of it and we need to stop bringing it home. So he says cultivating ethics is like embarking on a big cleanup job, getting rid of all our negative karma. And you don't need to have an auction to get rid of it. So going back to what he said earlier in this chapter, that habits might be familiar and comforting and secure, but they don't feel spacious. That's actually very confining. And the opposite feels spacious. There's all kinds of possibilities and room to move about, to change, to learn, and so forth. And it takes bravery to get out of the familiar and the secure. It's a lack of territory. And again, here's an example. As you know, I worked in a prison as a prison chaplain, and there's a word that the staff uses sometimes, and it's called institutionalization, which is a big word. What it means is that the inmate gets very comfortable being in prison. It's a secure place. He's always got a place to sleep. He will always have meals. The healthcare might not be the best, but quite honestly, it might be better than the healthcare that he had when he was out into the world. Needless to say, drug addicts and alcoholics aren't too concerned about healthcare, and so on and so forth. And you can get very, very comfortable in a situation like that. And then when you get released and go out into the world and having to take care of yourself, you can get extremely uncomfortable. And it is known that many former inmates will reoffend just so they can get back into the prison and have the security. And we don't want to be in that position. We want to get out of this little familiar world that we live in that is claustrophobic and confining and has no possibilities. So the idea is to be mindful of what's on our minds, pay attention to the thoughts, and when negative thoughts come in, treat them like seeds, weed seeds. You don't want to water the weed seeds. You want to uproot the weeds when they sprout. So don't do anything that is going to encourage those seeds to sprout and grow. So make an effort to change and transform. And he says on page 143, which is at the end of the chapter, no one suddenly becomes a guitarist. We have to pick up the guitar, take some lessons, and start to play it. And so that's what we have to do. And of course, since we are changing and going off in new directions, we will make some mistakes. You might say we'll hit some sour notes on that guitar, but that's how we learn. Traleg Rinpoche would say this. He said, you shoot an arrow at a target, either you hit the target or you miss. Either way, there's a message. So pay attention, be mindful, and you will learn and you will find that it's easier to create good karma than you had thought. So now there's a conclusion. And the conclusion is that meditation and our mundane life are interconnected and they impact each other. That fixation creates karma, and by removing fixation, we remove the mechanism that creates karma. So he feels that meditating is a part of enriching ourselves. So it's a very beneficial action to meditate, especially if you're meditating properly. If you're meditating improperly, then that can be a problem. And feeling enriched produces letting go and grasping, which is again something that I already said in the previous chapter. So we need to lead a good life and we need to practice to attain liberation. We can't separate the two and say, well, I'll meditate now and well, here it would be you might say, the worst possible approach. I'll meditate now, and then when I become enlightened, it'll be a lot easier to clean up my mundane life. It doesn't happen that way. That we need wisdom, and it arises from our mental and physical activity. So, through meditation and working on our mundane life, we start to see things more clearly. We learn how to interact with the world and the beings in it in a sane way. So mindfulness and stability allow us to do this. And both of them are cultivated when sitting, when doing your sitting meditation. But also, then we bring this into our mundane daily life. And actually, it's in our mundane daily life when it becomes obvious whether our sitting meditation practice is effective. The signs are, is your mind less disturbed now than in the past when something similar happens now versus a year ago or 2 years ago. That's an indication of stability. If it throws you off balance, you might say emotionally less. Even if it's only a little, that's a good sign. So the way to judge your meditation practice is not what's happening when you're meditating, because it's an awareness practice. We're not trying to attain something when we meditate. We're just trying to maintain our awareness and mindfulness of what's going on and bring our minds back to what's going on when it gets distracted. So with this approach, eventually we get to enter situations without an agenda, without a plan, without bias or prejudice. This is what an open mind is. I saw a bumper sticker. I think it was a neighbor of Rita Gross, because I was visiting her when I saw this car. And it said that the mind is like a parachute. It only works when it's open. So the more open your mind is, the more things are going to work out for you in terms of freedom, seeing possibilities, relationships with people, and so forth. And then on page 147, here is a long quote. In these times, at the very least, karma should be viewed similarly. It can be a means to be more meaningful and fulfilling life, steering us clear of the influences of nihilism and cynicism and the vacuous materialism and seductions of consumerism. So then here's an even longer quote that really struck me. This is on page 147 and 148. And he died in 2012, but this seems even more appropriate today in 2020. We appear to be jammed between the belief-based proposals of religious fundamentalists and the secular humanist push for getting more and more legislation through the courts to protect rights and to find justice for the oppressed, the underprivileged, and so forth. There is, of course, a need for such things, but it does not build a moral foundation. It provides no moral compass, which is the key issue. And so the last chapter, chapter 9, was about ethical foundation for karmic theory. And so this is very important, that karmic theory is very helpful here. We need to have, he feels, a sense of human decency. And this too seems woefully lacking right now, at least in the United States. And that it encourages thinking and discipline that promotes respect towards others and ourselves. So he says, if you want to be happy, and of course, who doesn't, use the knowledge and wisdom in karma as a guide to find happiness. And he says that you can do almost anything in life, and it can be good. There are really very few things that livelihoods that would be considered improper in Buddhism. And in terms of that, about livelihood and how we go through life, on 148, he said, if we can primarily and initially find richness in ourselves, we can then pursue these other aspirations with total abandonment and without them becoming an obsession. So this is the core of Buddhism, which is an inner path, that we have to find this richness in ourselves. And once we find that, we find that that richness is inexhaustible. The Dalai Lama has said that one candle can light 1,000 without being diminished. And Karmapa talks about how once we find that inner wealth, that our love is so great that we have no conditions on it. We're not giving love so that we can get something in return or expect others to give us something. We just give love without expectations. And if you can have that feeling of loving kindness as you go through life, you will be much happier, and the people that you come in contact with will be much happier. I posted a story yesterday. I did a retreat, a 6-day retreat with Thich Nhat Hanh and his very close assistant, Sister Chan Kong. They have been working together since the mid-60s. And so this was for people in criminal justice. And so there were breakout groups, and the breakout group that I was in was led by Sister Chan Kong. And there weren't any police in this group. I think the police had their own group, but this was people that worked in DA offices, clerical workers in the prison system, and I'm not sure where else, but people that were in the criminal justice system working. And after 6 days of these breakout meetings with Sister Chan Kong, she was very skillful, very kind and loving and caring, and brought everybody in to these discussions. There were even some sessions where we all sang together. So on the last session, one woman just blurted out, "I wish I could take you home with me." And that was the kind of feeling you had with her. You just wanted to take that love home with you. And that's the kind of person you want to be, especially in this time of self-isolation, when you're in with the people that perhaps they married you because they wanted to take you home with them. So now is a time to let that inner warmth come out. So he feels that being modern, scientific, progressive, and secular is a big problem. And quite honestly, I do too. Again, from my own personal experience, I was that person that, thought what we need is just more justice and more laws and so on and so forth, and more equality, and that religion was for the weak and the ignorant. But when I became extremely depressed, what I realized is that that was no way to lead a life. It was totally hollow. There was really nothing of substance there that I could lean on and find solace in. And then working through that depression is what brought me to Buddhism. So we're very, very fortunate. The very fact that you're here taking part in this class is an indication that you're very interested in Buddhism. And since I know all of you personally, I know that for a fact. I don't have to guess. So if we appreciate the benefits of these teachings and practices, the benefits of working on our thoughts and emotions and going inward to uncover our inner richness, that we become more and more open to them. They then lead us to more and more transformation, little by little by little. And so finally, the last sentence of the book is that if we really look at it, the beneficial effects of Buddhist practice are very, very subtle. And if we appreciate this, we will be more open to it and hence more open to transformation.